The following is an interview with Professor James Peterson of Lehigh University, conducted by Lindsay Stewart at the Penn State University as part of the 2012 National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute on Contemporary African American Literature.
Hi, thank you for being with us today, Dr. Peterson.
Sure, thank you for having me.
So how would you describe your approach to teaching African American literature as a tradition?
It's a great question. I think I have a sort of a multi-pronged approach. My own personal research, I'm invested in multimedia, in visual culture, and in music culture. And so actually the way that I approach teaching Africana studies as well as African American literature is to ensure that I have those prongs in place. And so when I teach African American literature, I want to teach the Nat Turner graphic novel, right? I also want to teach certain forms of music. I want to teach about the blues, and that might be teaching about the blues within Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Like for instance, if you go to the prologue in Invisible Man, the moment where he's playing the Louis Armstrong, what it feels to be so black and blue.
Yeah.
That's an important moment where you teach about the intersections between the blues and about music and about African American literature. Also a really important moment in Invisible Man. I don't want to go too deep into it here, but a really important moment for Invisible Man in terms of his own existential angst. And the reason why he connects to Louis Armstrong is because he feels bruised but also understands that whole black and blue metaphor. So it's powerful stuff for Ellison, but also a powerful example of how pedagogically we've got to be able to sort of function at those intersections of music, visual culture, and literature all at the same time.
Do you think your approach has changed over the years?
It has changed because when I'm not that young anymore, but as a young teacher, I stuck to the script of literature and really, I still am a traditionalist, but I was really a traditionalist when I first started out. Most of that's from fear. And I'm not saying that everyone who's a traditionalist is scared, even though everyone who's a traditionalist is scared. But from the fear of not, writing about or teaching about what I don't feel comfortable teaching about. But, I can remember when I was a graduate student at UPenn, two incredible things happened. One, Romery Bearden had an exhibit in our fine arts library, and I remember looking at the print for the cover of TV Guide when the Roots, the series, initially premiered in 1977, and I was mesmerized by that. And looking at, first of all, I was mesmerized because I can remember seeing as a child, and as a child you see a TV Guide, you don't think about it, but then seeing as a grad student at UPenn in the big print form, and you understand the impact and power of visual culture. And I said, I don't want to teach slave narratives anymore without having that image. And so I think you evolve, and I've had those different you have these confrontations with musical culture, with visual culture, and you realize you're not really teaching about the African American experience without that. It's just like that Ellison moment. If you can't talk about Louis Armstrong in some cogent way there, then you're missing some important opportunities. If you can't articulate to your students why Toni Morris's novel's called jazz, right, then you miss too much there. But that moment where you see the blown up version of Bearden's TV Guide cover for the Roots series, and you call yourself a scholar. I say that I teach about slave literature or enslaved narratives. You got to have those pieces there. And so it's the beauty of our culture is really the multifaceted nature of it. And so to not teach that is good. But I grew into that and grew out of my fear of talking about artistry and music and things that maybe I don't know as well as literature, but I know literature better because of that.
Okay, so thinking about African American literature as a tradition, what was your first response to Ken Warren's proclamation that the African American literature is over, has ended since segregation?
Yeah, I kind of respond to that the same way that I respond to Nas saying that hip hop is dead, right? That it's that those statements are particular rhetorical statements that when you look at Ken's work or you look at Nas's work, they're speaking about something specific. and they make those statements so that they're easily misinterpretable, right? Obviously, African American literature is not dead. I mean, tell that to Colson Whitehead, right? But what happens is that when you look at Colson Whitehead, or if you look at graphic narrative, which is, I think, a new sort of outgrowth for African American literature, what you're seeing is that the impulse and the impetus behind African American literature has shifted. And I think that's a more accurate assessment of what Ken is talking about. I mean, honestly, James Baldwin kind of said the same thing when he essentially said that protest fiction was dying out, right? He essentially, and he didn't just say, instead of him making the statement, what he did was he demonstrated it. And he showed us the flaws of Richard Wright's writing style. And Ellison kind of is trapped in the midst of that, right? He's trapped by that. His literary sensibility is too tightly contained by wanting to not be Richard Wright. Baldwin essentially says, well, we just can't have protests driving, it can't be the driving force of our literature. And so you can't tell, I mean, what does Ken now say when he reads Toni Morrison's Home? Right, the novel that just came out a few weeks ago. It's very small and extremely powerful. Right, clearly it's not protest fiction, and certainly not motivated by things like segregation and those things. Although she is dealing with things that overlap with things that I think Professor Warren believes are limited, or are some of the limitations of African American literature. But you can't. I dare him to go to Toni Morrison and say that, just say it to her face. He can't do that, right? But I also, again, return to Colson Whitehead, who is African American, is a novelist, and you have to search for the cues and clues within his texts that help you come to an understanding of why it is African American literature. Yeah. And I think when we do the investigation, and when you look at Kyle Baker's Nat Turner, and when you look at Toni Morrison's Home, and when you look at anything written by Colson Whitehead, clearly African American literature is alive and well. It's just like every other form of culture and music, it transforms, it develops. And Professor Warren's work is important in that it demarcates a transition, but not a death.
So what new trend or issue in African American literature has interested you in the last 2 decades?
Wow.
I know it's kind of broad.
That's broad. Well, there's been so much.
Let's just stick with the last decade.
Sure. I think there are a few things that have interested me most recently. One, I'm deeply interested in the ways in which, just as I was interested in the ways in which blues and jazz intervened in African American literature, I'm now interested in how hip hop culture appears in African American literature, like Heru Patah's Hip Hop Story, or Adam Mansbach's Angry Black White Boy, which is an amazing novel. So I'm interested in those things. Mansbach said that when he wrote Angry Black White Boy, what he envisioned was that he was doing for the novel what Chuck D did with sampling, and Public Enemy did with sampling and music. Now, those not familiar with this metaphor or this analogy, so the Bomb Squad, the production team for Public Enemy, realized that production in hip-hop had been limited to about 4 or 5 channels, right, in terms of sound. You would channel in 4 or 5 sounds on the mixing board. When they sat down to the mixing board, they wanted to use, and there's 64 channels on, they wanted to use all the channels. And that's why in Public Enemy's music you get all these different sounds in there. Mansbach likened himself to that. And what you see in his novel is you see a certain kind of hip-hop aesthetics emerge in the novel. So there's a lot of sampling, there's a lot of illusion, and he's using multiple channels. So I love that kind of work, and that's some of the stuff I've been looking for. Deeply, deeply, deeply interested and invested in the long-form comic book, or what people refer to as the graphic novel. Kyle Baker's Nat Turner, Matt Johnson's Incognegro, Shep Hendricks's Stagger Lee, and there's so many more. But just or Art Spiegelman's Mouse, The Watchmen by Alan Moore, and again, I could rattle off a bunch of them. Deeply interested in that one, just the role of sequential art and the intermingling of the sort of the written dialogue and the visual communication that occurs, just all the sort of thematics and theoretics of what happens in between the panels and the spaces between. I mean, just wonderful literary stuff going on there. So hip hop and ways in which hip hop is showing up in graphic novels and narratives, and then the visual culture of graphic pieces as well. Those are the things that have been interesting me most over the last decade. In fact, I think that's what you see you can see that in my scholarship and my work as well.
How important is it to you to bring these sort of contemporary literature like graphic novels, like hip-hop fiction into the classroom?
For me, and I want to be clear here not to dismiss other pedagogical approaches to the field, because I feel like my approaches have been dismissed for so long, right? So I don't want to do that. But I feel that it's almost impossible to really teach African American literature without graphic narratives at this point in time. There's too much important stuff that's been done, too much stuff that's been visualized in graphic form that hasn't been visualized historically that we need to include there. We really shouldn't be doing too much without film as well. I mean, here's the thing. Young people that we're encountering they're different kinds of learners than I am. I'm a very traditional learner. You give me a book with some words on it, I can read it. But there are young people like my son, who is 13, who are visual learners and who can learn so much more by seeing and by engaging media in different ways. Now, we can be traditionalists and shut people down from those opportunities to learn through media and through music and through film, but it makes much more sense to me to try to embrace some of those things. And there's easy ways to do it. You don't have to show Batman, the movie. You can show like the Black Power mixtape, Slavery by Another Name. Documentary films are essays.
Yeah.
They really are. They're visual essays. And so I feel like we have to overcome our fears about new media. And as African American literary scholars, we really need to be embracing those things and bringing them into the classroom as much as possible.
Hey, so transitioning a little bit into thinking about the conference, how did you prepare for your session?
Wow. So that's a great question. So I had this article that I knew a lot of brilliant young people were going to read. Anytime you prepare, or I prepare for something like this, I want to be proleptic, right? So I want to try to anticipate the kinds of questions and arguments and challenges that this room filled with brilliant young people are going to bring to bear on my little work. The preparation is a lot of mental preparation on my part, which was thinking through proleptically what kinds of things people were going to ask. I mean, in all honesty, I know that work is good, and the editors on that project are brilliant as well. The people who, and I talked about this in the talk, the people who challenged me at the paper presentation version of it a couple years back really got under my skin and really pushed me to go deeper with the work. I've published a lot, right? And so I know what the process is like, and I understand. Like, I've had my work crapped on a lot. Okay, I've had my stuff chopped up a lot. I've had conference presentations eviscerated a lot. I've had a lot of rejection, and so that prepares me well for these kinds of things. And let's be clear, I asked to do this. They didn't invite me to do this. I asked, hey, please, let me come in. Because one, is so important to have NEH support to do this kind of work. It's so important for Africana studies to be where it is at Penn State at this point in time. There's so many important things going on, and I have so many dear friends here that I wanted to subject myself to that level of criticism and critique as a part of contributing to this important process. As a scholar, how much more naked do you get than sharing your unpublished work with how many people in the room? 25 other really smart people. I could walk in there and take all my clothes off and be more comfortable than walking in there having to work through and defend my work. Now that also is just part of the process of developing as a scholar, that you make the work and you become more comfortable with how it gets critiqued and how you're not going to please everybody, you're not going to cite everything, you're not, you get more comfortable with it. It was a mental process in try to engage in a mild form of prolepsis so that it could still be informative for folk and not be too defensive. This is another thing. I don't want to be too defensive because your knee-jerk reaction is to punch back when someone punches you. But try not to be defensive, be calm, answer all the questions, and hopefully improve the work through the process.
Well, thank you for your time today, Dr. Peterson.
Thank you for having me.